Hello and welcome to Ranger in Time, Disaster on the Titanic, a book by Kate Mesner. In this video, I'll be reading the author's note section from the book. Author's note. The sinking of the Titanic is one of the most famous disasters in history. I'd read about it when I was in school and thought I knew the story, but when I began my research for this book, I discovered that the details I'd heard were only the beginning. Most people know about the passengers who lost their lives when the Titanic sank in the North Atlantic, but few stop to think about the shipbuilders who died before it even set sail. Shipyards of the early 1900s were risky places to work. Harland and Wolff in Belfast, Ireland was no exception. Men worked from 6 in the morning to 5:30 in the evening with 2 short breaks for breakfast and lunch. Conditions were loud, crowded, and dangerous. Falls were common. Men could be hit by cranes or crushed by falling plates. Wind could make the scaffolding collapse. Harland and Wolff Shipyard recorded 254 accidents while the Titanic was being built. 8 of those were fatal, like the accident that claimed the life of Patrick's father in this story. Today, the site of that shipyard is a world-class museum dedicated to telling the story of the building and the sinking of the Titanic. Construction of the Titanic began in late March of 1909. When it was finished 2 years later, it weighed 46,328 tons. The great ship was 882 feet long and 92 feet wide. The Titanic's launch happened on May 31st, 1911, with 100,000 people watching. But there were many jobs still to be done: painting, woodworking, bringing in furniture and supplies. On April 2nd, 1912, the ship set sail on its maiden voyage. Like Patrick, a number of men who'd helped to build the ship were invited on that trip, in case there was last-minute work to be done along the way. After the Titanic left Belfast, it went through sea trials, a series of tests to make sure everything was working properly. Then, before crossing the Atlantic, it made 3 stops to pick up passengers in Southampton, England, Cherbourg, France, and Queensland, Ireland. Those passengers came from many different countries. Some, like Patrick, were from Ireland. Others came from England, Germany, Sweden, and Norway. Hamad's and Miriam's characters in this book are based loosely on the stories of more than 80 Titanic passengers who came from villages in Lebanon. They were laborers, housekeepers, farmers, and families, hoping for a better life in America. In addition to the Titanic's human passengers, there were also animals on board when the ship set sail. The story of Jenny the cat is based on first-person accounts from people who remember seeing her on the ship and then leaving with her kittens when it docked in Southampton. Records show there were likely 12 dogs on board too. Among them was at least one French bulldog being brought home by an American who'd been visiting Paris. Other canine passengers reportedly included a Pomeranian, a Chow Chow, a King Charles Spaniel, and a lapdog named Frau Frau. There was also an Airedale named Kitty, owned by the millionaire John Jacob Astor, and a Pekingese named Sun Yat-sen, after the president of China. 3 of the smaller dogs survived by escaping in lifeboats with their owners. The main characters in Ranger in Time, Disaster on the Titanic, Patrick, Hamad, and Miriam, are fictional, but they're based on real passengers and crew members who were on board the ship. Some of the minor characters in this story were real people. Mr. Andrews, the ship designer Patrick watches through the big drawing room windows in Chapter 1, is Thomas Andrews, who designed the Titanic. Andrews was on board the ship and died when it sank. According to survivors' accounts, he really did toss steamer chairs overboard and run around the decks urging people to get in the lifeboats. The scene in Chapter 10 where a man tells his wife, "Go, Lottie, go and be brave. I'll get a seat in another boat," also features real passengers from the Titanic. Lottie was Charlotte Collier, a second-class passenger who was traveling with her husband Harvey and their 8-year-old daughter Marjorie. Charlotte and Marjorie survived, but Mr. Collier never found that seat in another boat. He was one of more than 1,500 people who died when the Titanic sank. The timeline of events that led to the ship sinking in this story is also based on historical documents. According to survivors' accounts, there really were arguments in the lifeboats that night. Some people fought to go back to the ship to rescue those in the water. Others feared that so many desperate, frightened people would overwhelm the lifeboats and then capsize. So even though there was room in many of the lifeboats, few people were rescued after the ship went down. Whether or not a passenger survived depended largely on who they were and how they were traveling. Men were ordered to let women and children board the lifeboats first, so only around 20% of the men on the Titanic survived, compared to about 74% of the women. First-class passengers were also more likely to survive. When the iceberg hit, crew members woke them up and brought them to the boat deck first. Third-class passengers had to wait. Many didn't speak English, so they didn't understand the warnings and directions. About 62% of Titanic's first-class passengers were rescued that night. Approximately 41% of its second-class passengers survived, compared to just around 25% of those traveling in third class. Even those who were lucky enough to make it into lifeboats had to wait hours for the Carpathia, the ship that rescued the Titanic survivors, to arrive. Survivors climbed up rope ladders that were lowered into the lifeboats. Some of the children were reportedly brought up in cloth sacks. This display from the Titanic Museum in Belfast shows some of the Titanic survivors in lifeboats and on board the Carpathia after they were rescued. You can find that display on page 128 of the book. If you don't have the book, I've tried to recreate that display in the slide that you see here. The lucky penny that Patrick gives Ranger was inspired by the real story of Thomas Miller, an assistant deck engineer on the Titanic. Miller had joined the crew of the big ship after his wife died, leaving him with two young sons to raise. Miller had hoped he could build a new life in New York, so he left his sons with an aunt and promised to send for them once he settled in America. According to a story shared later by Miller's grandson and published in Titanic, Belfast's own by Stephen Cameron, Miller gave each boy two shiny new 1912 pennies before he left on the trip. "They're this year's," he said. "Don't spend them until I get back." Miller was one of those who died when Titanic sank. His older son never spent his two pennies. And this wraps up the reading of the author's note section from the book Ranger in Time, Disaster on the Titanic by Kate Mesner.